Great evening, everyone. I'm experiencing some technical difficulties, so thank you for bearing with me and welcome to another broadcast of Motivational Mondays with Coach SaraLiz. It is a blessing to have you here as well as to share this time with you. I appreciate you giving me a portion of your time this evening. And I just want to start by asking you, how you feeling? How are you feeling?
I appreciate you giving me a pie.
And just saying, how you feeling? When I ask that question, do you get a little tense in your neck? Do you feel like, oh, how am I feeling? Or are you able to answer the question? How are you feeling? So before we get into our discussion tonight, I'd like to welcome you and offer that you take 3 deep breaths as we do each week, because we know breathing allows you to become present to this now moment, not being concerned about what happened just a minute ago or 5 minutes ago when I was having or 10 minutes ago as I was having issues getting on, or worrying about the future as to what's going to happen next. So we're going to take 3 deep breaths to bring ourselves center to this moment, to this time that we have together to have a conversation and to really kind of understand how you're feeling. So let's start by taking 3 deep breaths. That's breathing deeply through your nose and out through your mouth. So let's count, and when you breathe in through your nose, we're going to count 1, 2, 3, and then exhale out your mouth. So let's start. Let's breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Again, through your nose and out through your mouth. And one last time, in through your nose and out through your mouth. So I want to say welcome. And as a reminder, tonight's session, we're going to be, we have a very special guest, Dr. Monique Swift. She is a trauma expert. She is a psychologist, and she is doing a lot of work in our community, not just here in the US, but also globally in Ghana, on the continent of Africa, and she's just a dynamic force. And I brought her in today because it's my intention to, in each time that we meet and we have a conversation, is to offer you ways of being so that you can manifest the wealth that you desire, right? Because this is growing Black wealth. And as we highlighted previously, and I'll just recap really briefly, wealth has 5 key areas. Society's focus is on financial, but what we are focusing here on Motivational Mondays is first your spiritual wealth, which leads to better relationships, which is with yourself. And that's why we're going to be considering the trauma that is experiencing now, because we want to tap into how you're feeling. The third is your physical health, which leads to your financial wealth, which then leads to the time wealth that we all desire. So tonight, we're going to be talking about the trauma. We're going to be kind of examining what trauma is, especially because we are living in a time where trauma is very, very present. Not only our own trauma, right? Because we have the trauma that we could be what is experiencing in each one of our family members, the trauma of, if there's ancestral trauma, the trauma of friends, this trauma is present on TV and what is happening to all of us, because if it happens to one, it is happening to all. So we want to understand what trauma is and how trauma shows up in our life, shows up in our body, shows up and is present in our own space, and how we can kind of have some tips on how we can actually address and move through this trauma. Not only just move through it as to move it away, but to understand what it is so that we may become aware that we are experiencing trauma and also how we feel. And then also to understand and acknowledge what that trauma looks like, and then accept that we're in a space of what we're feeling and be okay with it. So it is important for me to bring this information and present it to you because these are tips and resources that I personally have have supported me on my journey, not only on my journey of healing, but also manifesting the vision that I am now living. So I ask, how are you feeling? Not up here, but we want to drop down into our hearts and understand how we're feeling in here, in our hearts. And I'll tap back, I'll kind of circle back to that and how to kind of dig in and some of the questions that we can ask as to how we are feeling in our hearts. Because we can quickly respond. You know, people always say, well, how you doing? And you're like, oh, I'm fine, girl, oh, I'm fine. Or I'm all right, what's up? You know, that's my man voice. So, you know, you can respond in various different ways. But then the moment somebody says, so how you feeling? Huh? I won't complain, or, you know, whatever we kind of respond, because we may not even want to express how we're feeling because we could be mad, rage, anger, just feel like just cussing somebody out, you know, all the things that we may not want to just express right there in that moment because somebody might not ask you how you feeling again. But I'm sincerely asking you, how you feeling? So I invite you, as we have this conversation, as Dr. Swift is about to join us, as we have this conversation, I ask that you kind of tap in as we're having it and just ask yourself, well, how am I feeling? See what that kind of stirs up. And then we'll circle back to it at the end to support you in some of the questions that we can kind of drop into our hearts and really understand what is in there. And then to provide you a resource that you can utilize and just a small practice that you can utilize to be able to kind of dig down deep, if that's what you choose to do. It's just an offering. So with that, I am going to welcome in our guest for this evening, Dr. Monique Swift.
Hey there.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Of course. And, you know, lending this expertise that you have, because, you know, you're a dynamic force out here in the New York, New Jersey area.
Okay. I'll take that.
Own it.
Okay, own it. I got it. I take that.
Because you're not just doing it here. You on the continent. Like you making moves, sis. You really out here dedicated and committed to the mental healing of our people. And I say thank you. I want to start by saying thank you.
I say.
And so, you know, tonight, you know, we're going to have a nice conversation, you know, just trying to prepping our audience and understanding, you know, we want to just kind of tap in as we have this conversation around trauma and, you know, why it's important right now to kind of understand how we're feeling. I offered them to throughout the conversation to kind of tap into themselves and ask them, how are they feeling? Not necessarily how you're doing, because that's the normal question that we ask, but we want to have the how you feeling. So I want to, you know, I kind of, you know, told our audience a little bit about you, because, you know, I know you as Dr. Swift, the psychologist, Dr. Swift, the trauma expert, Dr. Swift, the giver, the president of the New Jersey chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. But before we get into our discussion, what would you like our audience to know about you?
Okay, well, you know, I am a giver. I'm a healer, psychologist. I dedicate and devote much of my time to trying to help and heal specifically Black people, people in general, but most specifically Black people. That's what's prominent and foremost in my mind, on my agenda, and what consumes a lot of my time. And yeah, that's the short story.
Okay, awesome. So, and just one more question. What is it about our community? Because, there's the stigma of mental health in our community. Why psychology? Why the commitment? What is it that you have? Because I know that you come, you're deep rooted in supporting and healing our community. And you come from good stock as regards to meaning your dad and, all that he does in the community. So what was it that you wanted to carry that legacy on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm glad that you did bring up my dad, who is a clinical social worker, and kind of groomed me, really, without my even knowing. I think it very much groomed me in the field of psychology. I can recall early on doing, annual conventions. I would do presentations with him at annual conventions for the National Association of Black Social Workers. They were rich years. And so he kind of, I feel like somewhat genetically, but also, conditioned me in this way. He was always one to expose me to people, to help me see and recognize people. He would talk to me about, what I'm seeing, help me to explore in my mind what I'm seeing when I meet other people. So I think he was a big part of it. However, I didn't set out on a mission to become a psychologist. I was very interested in being an educator. That's what I was primarily interested in. When I went for my undergrad study, I was focusing on, I wanted to focus on education. And so that was my intention. And somewhere along the line, I was substitute teaching. And in the experience of substitute teaching, I found that I was constantly being driven toward, or just pulled in to recognizing the quiet student in the corner. What's going on? The one that kind of looked unkempt.
Right.
The one who seemed to be acting out or trying to be a clown, like, hey, come here, what's going on? And that just was a natural inclination for me to kind of pull them in and try to tune into what's going on, because that's not working in this environment. And I can beat them down in this environment if I want to and try to make them conform. But if I don't find out what happened that caused the behavior, then I'm not going to get what I want out of it. So it was that thinking that kind of drew me into counseling and psychology.
Okay. And that's very key, and kind of leads into our conversation, because it's the behavior, right? We may not know what we're experiencing or how we're feeling, but it shows up in our behavior.
Yep, exactly.
And a lot of that right now, with the times that we're living in, trauma is very present. And it can show up in our lives in so many different ways. And we may not even realize that I'm experiencing trauma, right? Because we think that it has to be sometimes physical, a blow to the head, some type of physical trauma. That is where, the misconception is that most trauma is unseen, right?
Yeah.
So what is trauma? Can you give us kind of like a basically a definition, or, kind of give us an idea of what actually trauma is, and what does it mean that you're a trauma expert?
Okay. So I think trauma is a lot less complicated than what most people think. I think what you're saying, the impression of trauma is this big thing that happens to people and happens kind of more to other people. Doesn't really happen to me, right? And so if I were to define trauma, there's a few different definitions out there, but I think SAMHSA, the definition that SAMHSA uses, is the one that I tend to rely on the most. And SAMHSA kind of points out three elements of trauma. It looks at an event, an experience, and an effect. So essentially what the definition holds is that there's an event, some sort of event that happens to people. It could be an out of the ordinary event, or it could be kind of like an event that's just kind of ongoing and subacute, I'm going to say. And the event is experienced as harmful, as threatening in some kind of way. And because of that experience, there is some sort of lasting injury to a spirit, to the psyche, to the psychological, emotional well-being of someone. And so those three components, they use a mnemonic they call the three E's, which is again event, effect, and event, experience, and effect, that actually make up trauma. Okay, and so in terms of understanding trauma, we go through experiences all the time that have lasting effects. Just with that definition alone, if we begin to reflect back on our lives and think about some of the things that happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago for some of us, and how it's impacting us today, we probably experienced trauma.
Yes.
And unbeknownst to us, diagnosed or undefined, but trauma nonetheless. In terms of like being a trauma expert, to be an expert simply is someone who has a specialized knowledge in a particular area, who the person who will be called on to use that knowledge to teach or guide or help other people in terms of understanding or functioning with that particular knowledge that they hold. And as a trauma expert, I'm often called to speak, and I consult a lot in the field of trauma, and most of my consultation is around becoming trauma informed.
Okay.
And if I could just give a quick understanding.
Absolutely.
So essentially being trauma informed, it's one thing to kind of understand trauma. It's another thing to act in a trauma informed way. And trauma informed is simply just utilizing the knowledge and information about trauma in order to avert re-traumatization, in order to help bridge the gap between traumatized people and healing services and resources that can help them.
Okay, awesome. So what I heard you say, there was a lot of gems that you just dropped. So there's the three E's. There's the event, experience, and effect that trauma can can be kind of defined as. Right.
Yes. And if I can just add, you need kind of all three. So we have many events happen, but that's not necessarily trauma.
Exactly.
I'm sorry. So I can experience something, you can experience something, and you could be traumatized and I not be traumatized. So it's more than just an event. A lot of times we think, oh, this happened, so they must be traumatized. So the key to trauma is that lasting effect. How the person experiences, which makes an effect or not.
Right. Okay. So it's that lasting effect, those three things.
Yeah.
However, it's the lasting effect that it equals, that event plus experience plus effect equals trauma. It's that lasting effect that equals out to trauma.
Correct.
Okay. And then I really appreciated that point about being trauma informed, right? Because that's the key, is being informed so that gap can be bridged. Yeah. Now, in your expertise as a psychologist, as well as a trauma expert, serving in, like I mentioned, you served here in the US, you served on the continent of Africa. And, as African Americans and Africans, what is one common thread that you have, that you've noticed as it relates to the prevalence of the stigma of mental health in our community?
So in terms of the prevalence of stigma, certainly I would have to say there's stigma in both. And if I could just kind of put parentheses around my reference to the continent, is most specifically Ghana.
Ghana, exactly.
Yes, because I have not traveled throughout, but I do think there's commonalities throughout, of course, but I do want to be, I'm most familiar with Ghana. And so in terms of stigma, there's definitely stigma around Black people and mental illness in both places. But when I think about it, the drivers toward those seem to be somewhat different. On the continent, in Ghana specifically, what I learned is that the stigmas in Ghana are mostly like driven by social marginalization.
Mhm.
There is a severe social marginalization that happens when somebody is tagged or labeled as being mentally ill.
Mhm.
Um, they still have they have a sane asylum. So what happens when somebody becomes they're labeled mentally ill? When they're mentally ill, they get locked down in an asylum. They still have
Mhm.
asylums there. Or because of traditional beliefs that illness comes from some sort of spiritual impairment, they also have prayer camps throughout the country where people go to prayer camps, and in these prayer camps often can be quite abusive,
Mhm.
where people might be tied to trees and they are starved or they undergo beatings and other things to help exercise these demon spirits that are creating the illness. And
Mhm.
so, because of this kind of traditional perspective about illness and what causes illness, these people are kind of locked away. Families turn away from people who are mentally ill, and the help is not as they're not as advanced, I'll say,
Mhm.
as what I see here. And I hate to make that comparison like that. And even forgive me for making that comparison. To say that they're less advanced, I didn't like that necessarily, that wording.
Mhm.
Um, but certainly there is a lot of change that's coming. There are groups that are organized. There are mental health agencies now. There are people, strong advocates that are really trying to help people to become more aware
Mhm.
um, and understanding of what mental illness is. It's not somebody who's just kind of babbling in the corner or who's trying to kill someone. That mental illness is, depression. Mental illness is anxiety, and so and these people can be helped.
Yes.
They don't need to be put away. So that the stigma due to kind of like what the treatment is,
Mhm.
the driver of stigma in Ghana specifically that I saw seems more connected with the treatment and the response to the mental health label. I think in my experience here in the US is a little bit different.
Mhm.
I would say largely here in the US, the stigma for Black people with mental health is around historical trauma.
Mhm.
It seems to be largely tied to historical trauma. Like historically, we have been exploited, we've been mistreated, we've been experimented on in the medical system.
Right.
And this is not something that happened yesterday and ended. This is
No,
something that
it
still
still it
continues,
still continues. This
right? And
medical apartheid is very real.
I was just about to mention the book, that Medical Apartheid is a book you want to pick up. It comes right up into the 80s and 90s. And so this stuff is still
2000.
happening. It's okay. There are references from 2000. Thank you.
Mhm.
So you definitely, there's this, what I'm call a healthy paranoia
Mhm.
about the medical system.
Mhm.
And so I think that's one of the drivers why there's a stigma, because I don't want to be affiliated, I don't want to be associated with that because I'm going to put myself in some sort of danger.
Dangerous,
I
right.
think that the second factor is somewhat connected to that, but a little bit different, and that is that um, the second thing is, look, there's no secret that the game is rigged against
Right. Right.
us.
Ain't that
I'm,
true?
I have to say a role playing. There's no secret about that. And because the game is rigged against us, we are very careful, and we have to be very
Yes, you do.
careful as it relates to giving more for us to be beaten with or
Right.
disadvantaged by.
Right.
And so if I go, unlike, perhaps a white person can go and go and sit and have psychoanalysis done for 20 years and talk about all their deep, dark secrets and it be fine and held confidential, I might be afraid that if I go tell someone my deep, dark secret, if I sit in a room and say, I am an alcoholic, let's say, for
Mhm.
example, maybe my children will be taken away from me, right?
Right.
That happens.
Right.
Maybe I might lose my job. I
Yes.
don't know what imaginable may happen, but I do know there's a possibility that if I admit this, it might work against me. And
Right.
so if there's that chance, what am I going to do? I'm going to suppress.
Yes.
And I'm not going to, and the danger in that too is that I'm not just going to suppress myself. This is something we teach our children.
You teach our children. Yes, exactly. Right. And just to kind of, what I heard what you said about, you know, in Ghana, there can be institutionalized, and you know, they can be looked at it in a different realm, right?
Yeah.
Then when you come here, you know, we have generational trauma that we experience that cause us to, you know, one, we're questioning about the doctors, right? Because especially as women and being subjects in American gynecology, we have to be careful about what we do, what we say, and, you know, how we are being knowledgeable about our bodies and going to the doctor, right? So there's so many different things. And then, you know, is it going to be used against us, right? Is it going to be used later? But then there's also in our community as well, where you may say, you know, I'm going to go, this is more acceptable now. But you say 20 years ago, if you would have say, I'm going to go to a therapist, there is going to be that family member that's going to say, what, you crazy?
Mm-hmm. You better believe it.
Right?
And it still is.
There's going to be that person even now. Yep. It may not happen as much because social media is being, you know, the children are being taught meditation and they're taught how to feel in school. So then there's that generational gap where the kids are being taught to feel, and they come home and they're supposed to be suppressing, and then that creates a conflict and a disconnect in the home.
Right,
so
right.
You have all of that, but then you do have us that can look at us and be like, you all right?
Right. You're on point.
You know, so that's why I wanted to kind of bring that up and have that conversation about, you know, the trauma and how, you know, it can, and the experience that we are having here as African Americans, and how, you know, in Ghana, you know, there is a stigma there. There is a fear there. Right. And what do we know about, you know, energy? Energy continues. It never dies. And if that is still very present in our homeland of Ghana, right, how is that vibrating over here into the energy that we are experiencing here in the US, right? It can go even deeper than just our parents. It'll go deeper than just of those that are here, but who were our ancestors that were brought here unwillingly, right? That even can be so deeply rooted in how we experience or even welcome in gaining support for our mental health. And so in talking about kind of bringing up that, you know, some of the ancestral trauma, right? Because that is real. What are some of the types and various types of drama? I said drama. Various types of
drama too.
It is drama now. It will bring up drama. But what are some of the various types of drama that you can, trauma, there was no drama there. What are the various types of trauma that you can share with our audience? And we kind of have that conversation of really kind of bringing in what are the various types of trauma, and you know, with the current state of our community, how does one know if their trauma is being triggered, or if they're experiencing trauma?
Right.
Because it's one thing to be triggered, and then it's one thing to be
experiencing trauma. Absolutely. I'm glad you make that distinction too. So the first question about types of trauma, and I might need you to remind me what the second part is, but in terms of types of trauma, so there's like trauma that I defined earlier, this overarching idea of trauma, and over time there's cropped up all these different like subtypes of trauma. And honestly, it became for me a little like, okay, you know, how do these connect? How do they relate? And so I actually created my own little, like, I guess, taxonomy of trauma. And I'm going to give you a abbreviated version of that. So essentially I have like categorized trauma in two broad categories, one individual trauma and one collective trauma. And so individual trauma essentially are injuries that happen to the individual on the individual level. These are the types of trauma, they are very based upon kind of how the trauma happens, what the event is, and how it shows up in life. So there could be like acute trauma. for example, which are more kind of DSM, diagnosable trauma that happens. It's usually a short term, discrete incident that happens, usually out of the ordinary. It's kind of that thing that people think about when they think about trauma. They think about maybe, somebody who went to war, or somebody who had a really severe car accident,
Yes.
or somebody who had a significant loss. And so that's trauma, that's more acute trauma. But what we're becoming more aware of, thankfully, is chronic trauma
Yes.
and the impact, because chronic trauma has a little bit of a different impact on people than like the acute trauma. So chronic trauma, for example, might be what we see with child abuse or domestic violence. So these things could happen one time, but often they're ongoing. And then there's like complex trauma that happens where the individual is injured because they're experiencing multiple types of chronic trauma. So this might be maybe a child who was, physically abused and also taken from the home because of the physical abuse and put in foster care where they didn't have adequate care and they felt threatened by other children. So this story goes on and on and on. So it's a very much more complex presentation of trauma. So, so there's acute, there's chronic, there's the complex trauma that I explained. There's also vicarious trauma, which is trauma that a lot of Black people, you're seeing a lot of articles about, we are experiencing because just about every day it feels like we're opening up the newspaper, we're going onto social media, and we are actually sometimes visibly seeing one of our people that look just like us taking their last breath.
Yes.
On camera.
Yes.
Right. And so that has an effect. And that now we're talking about vicarious. It didn't happen to me, but vicarious trauma nonetheless, because I'm being impacted. There's an example that I often talk about of a woman who I saw, this is years back, on social media, a Black woman who got pulled over by a police officer, white police officer, no problem. She was driving too slow. He let her go. He was very nice, but she did this video. She was terrified. She said she was crying when she did the video, and she said she was terrified. She was terrified because of all that. She was a military person, just leaving the base, not speeding, not doing anything wrong, but she was terrified because of what she had been seeing.
Right.
This is vicarious trauma. This is real for us. And so that's another thing that we're experiencing on an individual basis. And of course, racial trauma.
Yes.
Racial trauma, which is the injury that happens to me because I recognize that you have disadvantaged me in some kind of way or harmed me in some kind of way because I am Black, right? So these are individual level traumas that people experience, but then there's also, again, less spoken about, but far definitely critical element of trauma, and that is the collective trauma. And this has been my soapbox for kind of the last maybe couple of years, 2 or 3 years now, is about kind of elevating this idea of collective trauma. There's decent amount of literature on it, but I'm not seeing it in the clinical field. I'm not seeing it in, as much in conferences and so forth. But essentially, the collective traumas are traumas that happen to whole collectives,
people,
masses of people. So what we're not talking about a lot of individuals who have been traumatized. We're talking about a unit of people who have been traumatized by the same thing. So that might look like 9/11 for many of the citizens of the United States, right? There was a lot of trauma around 9/11. That might look like in another year or so, COVID for citizens of the United States. You see a lot of articles talking about the next pandemic, which we're kind of experiencing the next pandemic, which was the racial one. But the next pandemic was going to be the mental health part, be due to the experience of COVID. So so you have collectives of people who are experiencing a certain threat or trauma collectively, right? And so that's kind of one of the ways that trauma. So that's a mass trauma.
Okay.
Another type of collective trauma is historical trauma that you mentioned, right? And historical trauma being a trauma that happens to a collective of people over a lifespan. It's the accumulation of experiences that happen over a lifespan. And as far as I know, honestly, we like to say the Holocaust. We like to say all these people, other than I would say Native, which I don't like call them Native Americans or First Nations people who were here, indigenous people of North America who were here prior to Europeans coming over. They have also experienced a serious genocide and historical trauma as a result of the genocide that they've experienced and the oppression and so forth. So other than, these two groups, no other people have experienced
No.
the level of trauma that we've experienced over a lifespan.
Right.
So I'm sorry, that's
Yeah.
part of my soapbox.
No,
That's another
no.
part anyway.
And, well, what I heard is that you're going to be starting something on that collective trauma since it's nothing.
I've been trying.
Well,
yeah, I've been trying. I was before COVID. I was trying to host a conference, and I'm actually I was talking in a conversation about that earlier today, trying to raise that up again. We might do it virtually, so I'm working on it.
Yeah,
I'm working on
and
it.
And that's very needed now, right? In understanding that collective trauma, and I wanted to kind of have that conversation around that because when we think of trauma, sometimes we just think about ourselves and or somewhat happens in our family, but that collective trauma that is now happening in our community, right? And it is consistently present. And because we are in a space of stillness, even though we're kind of moving about, it's still kind of limited. We just opened here in Jersey, so we're still kind of limited. So we do have to kind of tap in and understand how we feel. Are we really, how are we feeling? Because this is right in front of us.
Yeah.
And we are, like you said, it is vicariously happening to us, but then it is also happening to us collectively. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now, what so in saying, in the experience that you broke it down very nicely of how we could be experiencing trauma through the various different types of trauma. Are there any recommendations that you would like that you can offer about working through trauma and just mental health overall?
Yeah, I think one of the principal ideas behind trauma, and this is a principal idea from the literature and framework of trauma-informed care, and that is the idea that making the shift from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And so the idea that I would assert above all is recognizing that trauma is not something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
As we often think we're defective, we did something wrong, there's something wrong with us, or maybe I should have been able to handle it and I couldn't. All of these kind of ways of thinking of ourselves, self-blame, right? Shame, all of these things. And so trauma is not something that is wrong with you. It is something that happened to you. It is not a fault of yours. And so that's the first step, I think, in terms of, helping people to kind of work through, helping people to kind of navigate the waters of trauma and just understanding that something happened to them. Also, I think education and awareness is key because, again, I get, notions about trauma that are incomplete perhaps, or misinformed ideas about trauma. So really educating and becoming aware of trauma and how it shows up. And because you can't, if you don't see it, you can't work through it. I want to give a quick example. One of the consultant pieces that I do is with the police department in Newark, New Jersey, and with Equal Justice USA, is a criminal justice reform organization, and I'm one of the consultants. So we created a curriculum that we deliver to police officers and community members to try to help kind of bridge mutual understanding and so forth. But the point here is that one of the things that we do, it's a 2-day, it used to be 3-day, but it's a 2-day workshop. At the beginning and at the end, we have them take the ACE survey. The ACE survey is Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, and basically it's a 10-question survey that assesses the amount of trauma that one has experienced in childhood. And so they're in the areas of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. And so based upon those, you have this ACE score, right? So the more traumas, the higher the score. But what we've seen with evaluating our program is that the surveys that come in the beginning, they're paired with the surveys at the end. We are consistently seeing that people will report, let's say, 4 aces in the beginning, but after taking the course, going through the course, they'll report like 7 or 8, or maybe they report 0 at first, and then it's 5 or 6. But what's happening here? Did something happen? It is only a week apart. Nothing happened particularly often, although sometimes things do happen. But the thing that changed is their awareness.
Yes.
Whereas they were not aware before that, oh, I have experienced this trauma through education, through understanding and seeing how trauma shows up in their lives. Now they're able to look at it and say, I have experienced trauma.
Yes.
And this is how it came up in my life.
Yes.
So the education, go ahead.
No, go ahead, continue.
The education is an important piece. Also, that self-assessment for us, you know, I think especially Black people, we are seduced into this irrational thought that if we don't recognize it, it doesn't exist.
Right. Or so if I just keep going and I don't think about it,
then it's gone.
I'm good.
Right. And so really not, you know, kind of pushing against that and stopping and taking the time to self-assess and recognize the injuries and the wounds that have been inflicted. Hardly any of us, whether Black or white or anyone in between, have get through this life without some sort of experience of trauma. So that's and then as a final point, like creating spaces and seeking spaces, because there are spaces out there where you can talk about trauma and do your healing work. And that's the important piece too.
And, you know, I really appreciate that because, you know, like you said, we have to create it sometimes. We can create it, but we have to seek the support that we desire to have, because we want to have a different life. We want to make a different choice. And I wanted to kind of piggyback on what you said about self-assessment, because a lot of time what happens also is we tell ourselves, I got to feed my kids. I got these bills to pay. I got to go to school so my kids can have something better, because I want to come up. I want to get this promotion. I don't have time to think about myself. I don't have time to sit and take time to meditate. I don't have time to do any self-assessment because I'm busy trying to eat and feed my kids. And that was something that we experienced. And what our audience doesn't know is that you're my partner in good too, right? Because we were partners in good in Ghana in January, and that was part of what we experienced. It was just the basic needs of water, clean water, food, and the parents may not be able to read and write, but making sure that their kids have a different experience. They didn't have time to know that the pain in their neck that they've been experiencing for years and months and things is not something that they deserve to experience. And that the stress in their bodies and how their bodies may have been breaking down because of the stress, just to be able to take a moment and breathe was so appreciative of them, because that same situation is here. It's different. Our economics situation is different, but the mentality of having to go and take care of our family, keep them safe now, right? You have children. You're trying to make sure they get from A to B without incident. You had 14 and 15-year-old kids just out on the front lawn, not doing nothing wrong, but they being held at gunpoint. So we have all of these various things. So then there's that, I don't have time to do the self-assessment. But it's self-assessment doesn't always take 30 and 40 and 50 minutes. It can just be 5 minutes. Or like I did in the beginning of our conversation, of taking three deep breaths. How long does taking a breath take? A minute, maybe?
Right. So, I mean, the idea, you can't afford not to. You don't have time not to, because the cost is going to happen in advance or in the end. And often if you wait until the end, the cost is going to be much higher and much greater.
Yes, exactly. So, And that's that's what courage is, right? Being able to know what to do before you have to do it.
That's right. That's right.
And stepping into it.
Indeed.
So,
I like that.
so before we kind of wrap up here, I want to ask you to tell us about the Association of Black Psychologists, the New Jersey chapter, and how we can be of support. You know, I know about it.
I know you know.
I want you to be able to, tell us. I know you're the seating president for the second term.
Yes.
And so that says a lot about your leadership. And as what I just would like for you to let us know what you want us to know about the New Jersey chapter and even the association, the national, overall, who the Association of Black Psychologists are, and then how can we support?
Yeah, so thank you so much for that, because we need the support. I mean,
Yes,
we're an amazing group of people, but of course, we are our talents, our gifts, what we have to offer has to be in connection with the community.
Mm-hmm.
It can't exist just by ourselves. And so the Association of Black Psychologists is a national association of psychologists of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, what I always assert when I'm explaining this is that we are not a black-faced white psychology group. And I think that's really important. Not at all, right?
Not at all.
And it's so important to say that, because sometimes if we just put a black face on it, it is black. And so being black and being African-centered is not, it's not just an appearance. There's a whole philosophy and tradition that extends from the beginning of time, and that we drink from, we pull from, in order to bring to spaces where we do our healing work for Black people. And so it is, this is what this group is. And in New Jersey, of course, we have a chapter where I am the president of the chapter. And we're doing really wonderful things. Our commitment is to helping to destroy and dispel the whole lie of Black inferiority and white superiority, right? And that exists in the being, in us, in our clinical work. We're defying that. And also it exists in our society. It exists in the literature. It exists in the structures of society. And so we are also, there are some who are doing research and contributing to the literature in very relevant ways that will help to illuminate and help people to understand our plight, our struggle, and then how to approach it, how to deal with us in the long term. So that's one. So we're dedicated to education. We're dedicated to, making relevant contributions to the literature. We're dedicated to creating spaces. One of the things that we've been doing here during COVID is the Association of Black Psychologists has launched Salbona healing circles throughout the nation that are just spaces where Black people can come together and just support one another and heal. So creating spaces where Black people can heal, and also developing culturally informed paradigms for working with Black people. And so this is kind of, in a nutshell, what we're about. And to your question about supporting, yes, you can support. You can go to njabpsi.org, and that's spelled njabpsi.org. And our information is on there. You can contact us there, but you can also make a donation. That would be very helpful if people can make a donation. But also we have, the best of the best, the brightest of the brightest. You invite some of our members. If you have a forum, invite us to speak. I just, spirit just closed my mouth. Invite us to speak and tell others about our organization so that, we can become, we do want to become, and part of my presidency, to make us more known to the community, to Black people, but also to white spaces as well. They need to understand who we are, and they need to understand how to handle and manage us. And that's part of what we do.
Yes. And I'd just like to add, as the membership co-lead of the New Jersey the chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists. If you are a mental health advocate, you do not have to be a psychologist to join us.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you.
And if you are interested in learning more and being a part and how you can even show up and support in, educating, right? Because that was what we talked about. You may, have some experience in another space that can contribute to what we are doing in within the New Jersey, community. So let's just keep that in mind, that you do not have to be a psychologist in order to join the Association of Black
And I mentioned one more thing along the lines of what you're saying. I know time is ticking. But along those lines, another thing that we partnered with the Institute of the Black World 21st Century Black Family Summit, who is convening a listening line, because Black people got hit hard with COVID. And then we got hit hard also with all the racial injury that has happened as a subsequent, and the hangings and all these kinds of things that have been happening. So we are an ignored population of people. There's services out there, but they're not focusing on us. So they have created this listening line for Black people to call into. And I'll send you the flyer. Maybe you can post on your website.
We'll post
I don't have the number.
I'll post some of these additional resources after this, but then also I'll add to it once, once we have that conversation. Yes, that's no problem.
So, but I just wanted to say, with regard to that, that's one of the areas where you don't have to be a psychologist to help out. That would be one of the initiatives that we are undertaking, that we welcome everybody to help. There's an orientation you'll go through, and you can help the Black helper who didn't have the luxury to shelter in place. I'm sorry.
Okay, you want to say hi.
Didn't have the luxury to shelter in place. It was like over 80-some%, I think over 85% of Black people had to be out there in COVID, just so the cities and the state can function. And so they need our support. They need our help. So I'm sorry.
Absolutely. No apologies necessary.
No, time is ticking.
That's very, very important. And as we get ready to close out, I have 2 questions for you. And because this is Motivational Monday.
Indeed.
So I want to say thank you, first of all, for all of sharing your experience, of sharing your knowledge and your commitment to our community. It does not go unnoticed. It is appreciated. You are a very humble being. And I'm grateful to have you tonight as my guest, but then also to have you as my colleague and my friend. So I say thank you for coming, and I just wanted others to see the beauty in your brilliance.
Thank you.
As so that it can, because this is an important topic, and it's just that's why we align, because it's my intention to do whatever I can to support our community in whatever way I can. So I say thank you, my sister.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And before we close out, 2 quick questions. What keeps you motivated? That's the first one.
I'm going to make it very brief. The Bible says, where there's no vision, a people perish. And I think when I reflect on what keeps me going, it's the vision that I have for a better tomorrow.
Yes. Powerful, powerful. And my second and final question is, from this now moment in time going forward, how are you motivated to be?
From this moment, I've said a lot. I've said a lot here and even prior to here. And from this moment forward, I have to hold myself in integrity with who I say that I am and how I see myself. And that's where I be.
Yay! Hey, I like where you be. Thank you, my sister. I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you for doing this and for having me and seeing any worth and value in what I can share and say to your audience. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's always of a great appreciation and gratitude.
Yes.
To have to share time with you, my sister. So Ashe. And you're welcome to stay as I wrap up.
please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my dear friends, a lot was shared tonight. And as I started our conversation, I asked you, how are you feeling? And as Dr. Swift highlighted, what trauma is. It's three things that could take place: an event, an experience, and the effect. So it's event plus experience plus effect, and how that impacts you, that equals the trauma. So have you experienced trauma? Based on the types of trauma that Dr. Swift highlighted, the vicarious trauma, the collective trauma, not to mention the individualized trauma. I could say, and I can safely assume that answer would be yes. So what now? I asked you, how do you feel? And sometimes we can go right here to the head, but after we think and we consider, after this conversation, as what we kind of highlighted what Dr. Swift said about the survey that they take and how that shifts in time, just in this hour that we've been talking, are you now a little bit more present as to how you feel? I'd like to share with you a few questions that you can ask, because how you feel is not up here, it's in here. And sometimes the fear of dropping down into our hearts can cause us to just hurry past how we feel. But I invite you to ask, what is in your heart? What are you harboring in your heart? Is your heart a storage bin for the hurts and pains of the past? Is your heart a quicksand in which your feet become continuously cemented, if not vacuumed? Is your heart the place where you generate all of your worries, fears, anxieties about what is ahead of you? Is your heart the place where you enact dramatizations of polarizations? Is your heart a fertile ground for seeds of promise? Is your heart the cozy fireplace that has everyone feel at home? Is your heart a safe place to explore the hurts and the pains of the past so that the light of truth can dissipate the darkness? Is your heart fertile soil for seeds of righteousness? Is your heart a place of trust and truth, a place of reconciliation and forgiveness? Is your heart a harvest of all of the beauty of the world left as a legacy for you to read? So I ask you, what is in your heart? What is that feeling that you feel that you deny and have been running from, that you have buried, that you have hidden from? I offer that you take a few minutes this evening and consider, what is in your heart? How do you feel? And what I'll do is I will add I'll put in our chat in some comments and on how you can do a brief examination, just a brief exercise. When you ask yourself, what do I feel? How do I feel? Just when you ask that question and what is in your heart, just take 5 minutes or even 3 minutes, whatever time that you have, and just dump it out. It doesn't have to do a brain dump. It doesn't have to be in any form, but just get how you feel out. You can be angry. You can be, you can be scared. These are all feelings that you are worthy of having. You are worthy of feeling, because this is our life. And no one has lived your life the way that you have. No one has had the experiences that you have had. No one has, the events affect our lives differently. No one has had the effects impact our lives the way that we have. No one has had these experiences and that trauma impact us the way that it has you. So free of judgment, free of criticism, ask yourself, how am I feeling? What is in my heart? So I like to leave you with an affirmation, but before I leave you with the affirmation, those questions that I asked came from this dynamic book, The Sacred Yes. It's a phenomenal book that I highly recommend, and I will put this in the comments as well as a recommendation. And one of the books I also want to inform you about is what we talked about, medical apartheid. Educating yourself about what is happening in our community, what has happened in our community, and why it is important to be in tune with your body and educate yourselves before you go to the doctor, to educate yourselves in all aspects, because this is present. It didn't stop with the syphilis experiment. Didn't stop there. That was just the start of the exposure. So this is something to educate yourselves with, and please add this to your collection of books. This is very, very important. So with that, I will close with an affirmation. The affirmation is, I am aware of my feelings. I now acknowledge, accept, and trust the process of life. I am safe. May you have a wonderful evening. May you choose yourself. May you stand in the truth of who you are and accept, to become aware, accept, and acknowledge your feelings, because it truly does lead to your own personal freedom. Have a great night. Thanks again for your time. Thank you for staying around. Have a good night.
I love
Thanks
it.
so much.
Should I get off? Okay.